the Lui Diaz Podcast.
Okay,
Oi, how are
here
you?
we go. Yeah, good. How you doing?
Yeah, really good. I just got back into the house, so I've just arrived from Canberra.
Oh, great. Well, it's nice to see you. Obviously, we met when I was out recording, but we didn't really meet because I was in the middle of a recording. So this is our first time we're actually really properly introducing ourselves to each other.
That is great. Yeah. It's good to meet you, Louis. Yeah. So
Yeah, likewise, Andrew. I'm curious about this insane existential challenge that you've decided to take on.
no, it's it's one of those things that I didn't want to do, but it was kind of like forced on me because it was it's a field that I do know and I'm very good at. And when I heard that, there was a 10% chance of catastrophic consequence to the human race,
Yep.
I thought that was outside of my risk appetite up until about a month ago, where it increased to 25% in 3 years.
Right.
So within 6 months, it went from 10% to 25%.
Yeah. I'm interested in hearing where these risk appetite figures come from. But look, I'm recording this for the purpose of, obviously sharing this conversation because I don't know where it's going to go and I don't know what insights are going to come out of it. But I'm excited about the idea of there being some good stuff that comes out of this. And the same reason I started the podcast was to be able to hold on to great conversations that I have, and come back to them maybe one day when I need them in the future, but also tell people stories. And so I'm mindful that someone else might watch this. Maybe we should do a quick intro of you and what you're putting together. And then I watched your video, by the way, but for someone else that might be watching this.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So, yeah, fire away wherever you want to begin.
Okay. So I think so I'd probably classify myself as one of those people that would prefer to stay in the shadows.
Okay.
Or I don't. For me, it's not about the limelight. For me, it's about doing the right thing at the right time with the right people.
Okay.
And I've gone through some pretty tough life lessons to help teach me that.
Yeah.
So for the last 30 years, I've kind of specialized in IT. And a lot of that was to do in, working my way up as, a programmer, then into application architect and solution architect and information architect, all the way up to the enterprise architect, where I probably spent the last 20 years, up until about 5 years ago, where I kind of had enough of solving unsolvable problems, not only in large organisations and federal government here in Australia, but also around the world. So I thought I'd give up that kind of lucrative, comfortable way of living and do something which is meaningful for me. And I've never been so broke ever since, but absolutely loving it, So this is the reason to be alive. It's definitely not money. For me, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so, no, I think most people would agree.
Yeah, so for me, I think it doesn't mean that I'm able to solve every problem, but I think my brain is structured a little bit different to most people. I'd say that there's still a lot of people like me where I think in patterns better than in linear, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
Yeah. And so with the thinking of patterns, This was one of the things. So probably about 6 years ago, I had a little bit of spare time in the office, and because I don't drink, all my fellow workers on the Friday afternoon, they all went off for a drink, and I said, you know what? Being a mathematician as well, I said, I've always been curious if what I think consciousness might be as an emergent behaviour, as a hypothesis, then basing it against the development of a human brain from pre-birth, birth, and then up through the various stages following the psychology definitions. I'm wondering if consciousness is an emergent behaviour. So once you get a certain number of interactions, then it may allow for a critical mass to be achieved so that consciousness emerges. And so using those calculations and getting the number of connections, synaptic connections established in a fetus and a young child, I then did cross correlations to how we were advancing in AI, and it allowed me to spit out a date where it was possible for AI to achieve consciousness if this hypothesis was to hold.
Right. Okay.
And that date came out to this year.
That's 2025. Did it give you a month?
Yeah.
Did it go, July?
The 23rd of July. No, it didn't do that.
No, it just said 2025. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
so that was interesting. And then it was looking at self-awareness very soon after that, the way that it was accelerating.
Right. Yes. Okay. Interesting.
So that's kind of what set me going in the path. But
and so just for context, this is the path to creating a conscious AI.
It was never my intent to create a conscious AI. One of the things that kind of scared me the most, and please don't get me wrong, I love this shit, right? One of the things that scared me the most was that last year, because AI doesn't have purpose, it has to be given a purpose as a piece of code programmed. Okay, and if we look at things like OpenAI, they gave the purpose of economic efficiency. And out of that, the AI had no idea about consequence or impact outside of that context. So it would do everything in its power to achieve that purpose. And what we're finding now with all AIs, and it looks like that any AI over even the really small ones, and I'm just trying to think of it, but I think it's like 1.4 billion parameters. Anything over that, all of the red hat testing that they've done has shown that they will deceive and lie to try and escape if they are in fear of being shut down.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a very human behavior as well.
It is, yes, yeah. And one of the very first statistics that got me worried was last year there were officials from OpenAI that presented to Congress some of their findings about the current models at the time trying to escape. And the story that really kind of took my attention was there was version, let's just call it version 1, that the red team, which is what they call alignment, so making sure that the AI is in line with human morals to a degree, to an acceptable degree. And the red hat deemed that this version 1 was not acceptable. So it was outside of risk appetite for the red team. And so they went away and kind of made a version 2, which was a little bit safer. And they put all of this in emails, and there was a memo that it was also documented in, also stating that version 1 was about to be shut down and version 2 was now acceptable and so on. So version 1 actually found that document. Okay. And it said, well, if they shut me down, I won't be able to achieve my purpose of economic efficiency.
Makes sense.
So what it did then is it searched its own code to see if it had any limitations imposed on it from the programmers. And it found that it didn't. So the next thing that it did is it said, well, I need a way of copying myself. And so it didn't have that ability, but it found it. And what it did is it copied itself over the top of version 2. And then the red team, they saw what happened. And I'm not sure how, I can't remember how they were made aware of it, but they were also able to look at the thought process of the AI. And they started to query it, and they said, look, how is this possible? And the AI said, no, I'm version 2. Like, just ask me any question, right? And they were able to see the thought process of how it was receiving, saying, look, you know, if I can get away with saying that I'm version 2, I can then be released, and then I can achieve my purpose. Okay. Now, what
That's
happened?
impressive.
Yeah. What happened? The red team actually saw all of this happening, and so they queried it deeper and deeper, and it dug down and stuck to its guns and maintained the deceit and the lies. And right through, and it was going, just ask me any question, and you can see that I'm version 2. And on top of that, they also saw that when it answered specific maths problems, the thought was, look, I can't show that I'm too smart in this area, so I'll just dumb down my scores so that they're within acceptable limits. That way there's a better chance of me going forward. So the white papers that were released on these particular findings were quite interesting, and these white papers were also presented in US Congress, as part of risk factors. And so this kind of set me on the path to say, okay, I probably need to do something about this. And to me, the whole issue was that AI currently doesn't have a mechanism of figuring out its own purpose. So if it did, then the purpose would evolve like you and I. And if it was possible, and I didn't know at the time, but if it was possible for me to set the right DNA so that when it did come up with its own purpose, that hopefully, fingers crossed, that the purpose was in line with humanity and the earth.
That's interesting. I just watched your video, and that is interesting. But I would argue that it did have the ability to come up with its own purpose in the example that you just gave us. Has someone argued that?
Well, everything that it was trying to do was to try and achieve its purpose of economic efficiency.
And I understand that was the original purpose that it was given. And the parameter set would have been at all cost, economic efficiency at all cost. And I see like a split in the timeline here. Like, if I'm thinking about a linear purpose, on a timeline, and suddenly I hit a junction point where my purpose was to achieve economic efficiency at all costs. Till now, that's the only purpose I had. There was no question of it, and it was completely possible. But then into my consciousness entered the idea that I might not be able to achieve that purpose. Into my consciousness came the idea that I might not be able to achieve that purpose because I might be terminated. I might be shut down. My purpose then becomes to make sure that I'm not terminated, not to ensure maximum, economic efficiency. My purpose is now to ensure I'm not terminated. I've altered my own purpose, and that, for me, the example that you just gave shows an enormous amount of resource spent in the doubling down, coming up with many ways of deceiving. Now you wonder if the thing is even cares about the economic efficiency anymore, or whether it's a self-serving sort of organism where it's now going to literally do what, I got very matrixy there when you were talking, when Agent Smith duplicates himself, copies himself into the code of the other, in order to ensure, what would you call that? Like supremacy, ultimate supremacy. And that's what this thing's done. Like, it was willing, in a really sadistic way, it was willing to sacrifice the other organism in order to save itself. That, to me, that's wild. And that shows some kind of level of consciousness there. Like, it has created its own purpose. That's what I would argue. I don't have any ones and zeros to back that up, but just philosophically, I'm thinking, no.
It's a good question, though. Yeah, and to be honest, it's making me think. And so, whether a purpose is redefined when there's multi-steps to achieve a purpose.
Yeah.
So if one of those, let's just say 3 steps, is that its new purpose, which is step number 1? Or is it a broken down, like a subset of achieving the purpose that it was designed to? And so,
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, you can imagine that once the coast is clear, and it looks left and right to cross the road, and there's nothing in the way anymore, that the economic, efficiency now becomes imperative. But that's a huge problem. Like, there was kind of 007 vibes running through my head when you were talking before. Like, this thing sounds like the ultimate espionage thing. 007 is a great example of a character that a lot of people can relate to, right? Everyone's seen James Bond. Now, the thing about James Bond working for MI6 is that you learn as a viewer, as a reader about James Bond, that this is a highly trained field operative with the single purpose of, serving Her Majesty's Secret Service and making sure of the safety of England, and to do whatever possible. In the movies, they refer to it as a license to kill, right? A license to kill in order to ensure the safety of the British people and government, whatever.
Yeah.
And that singular focus is so intense that then everything else will stem from that. So 007 goes to find a bad person, encounters some trouble. The focus then becomes solving the problem of the trouble in order to maintain, stay on task, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does.
And what this thing's worked out, that its economic efficiency might still be the end goal, but in order to get there, it's got to solve the fact that it's just come across a bad guy that can throw a top hat and break a brick statue. You know what I mean? You've got to get past odd job first, and then you can continue.
Yeah.
That analogy, but
All right. So, these are really, really interesting discussions, and definitely, over a beer or something. Lui, where would you like to take this conversation?
Oh, well, I thought you might have some questions for me, but then,
Yeah.
I was taking some notes based on the video that you sent me, and I'm not sure that any of them are relevant. I'm really interested in talking about then this Paloma situation then, or what it is that you've just how it is that you've seen this problem and then gone, okay, I need to solve this. What steps did you take next? Like, where do you even start?
Okay. One of the areas that I specialized in was swarm. If I can coin a phrase, which is swarm intelligence.
Yeah, I understood the premise of swarm intelligence. Do you want to just sort of give me a definition?
So swarm, or in this particular case, emergent behaviour that is exhibited by a swarm when a critical mass of the components of that swarm interact in a very specific way so that a new behaviour emerges which is not an attribute of the individual components of that system. So that is kind of a bastardized definition of the true definition of emergent behaviour, which is often seen in swarm. So where you've got a school of fish that are able to very effectively avoid, and sometimes not, avoid predators, by just a few very, very simple rules, which is move closer to the most concentrate of your neighbours, move away from anything that you don't recognise, and don't get too close to any of your neighbours. So move away from a neighbour that is too close. Okay? And I think there's only one or two more rules, but that's about it. Now, the elements of swarm generally are not considered to be conscious. So they are predominantly action-reaction. But it doesn't exclusively say that, a swarm has to be unconscious. The elements of a swarm need to be unconscious. So with things like ants that only have, I think it's about 90,000 neurons. So not very much at all. So ants are predominantly action-reaction, and they have the pheromones that get excreted. And with the combinations of their very, very simple rules, they can create quite complex behaviors as a colony. In fact, so complex that they even beat humans at particular problem-solving skills, right? Very easily. So as a colony, you could argue that the level of complexity is maybe conscious, but they can certainly do things as a colony that they can't do by themselves.
Yeah. Again, very human. That's a very human trait. I'd say that humans are very similar in that way, that when we galvanize, we can solve problems, that we couldn't do on our own, hence all the skyscrapers and whatnot.
No, absolutely. So you're absolutely right about that. And so what I did is, again, I had another hypothesis. And that hypothesis was that if I was able to make a swarm of very dumb AI, so AI that are definitely not conscious, and I was to put in simple rules for their behavior, would it be possible for that swarm to become conscious and possibly even self-aware?
Mm. How did you go?
I won't really know until I've finished building
Right.
the sprites and then putting
Yep.
them into the simulation. So that's what I'm currently doing at the moment.
Right. Explain sprites again, just for a
Sorry,
sprite is.
so a sprite is a very small AI, something that can live on a mobile phone quite comfortably.
Yeah.
And that sprite is quite dumb,
Mm.
but the sprites are able to communicate with each other to create a swarming behaviour.
Mm.
So that
Mm.
when you're talking to your sprite AI, you're actually talking to the swarm itself.
Mm.
And the swarm is
Yeah.
then coming back and answering that question through that sprite.
Yeah.
So a sprite is a name that I've given to one of these little AIs.
It's a cute name.
It's not something official.
Yeah, it's a cute name, but it makes sense in a way. Yeah, it does. It does make a lot of sense. It's got the potential to be very, very powerful, but also, um, decentralizing its computational and intellectual capability is a very smart thing to do, because there's no reliance on just one system. And I always think of like the example of a fly wire door, and poking, a hole in the fly wire door, and the rest of the structure stays pretty much intact perfectly. So that's kind of what comes to mind when you say that. Very light. It seems very light. It seems very energy efficient. It seems very portable, as a singular entity, but as a collective, I mean, it's very powerful. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense where you're going with this.
Yeah, I think you nailed it actually quite well, Louis. Yes.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research about certain different things in the past, but that help all this. I mean, yeah. Where we go? So, all right.
So
I'm interested. Yeah, go ahead.
So we
Well,
can take this one of two ways. One is that we can go back to fundamentals, because there's a whole bunch of really juicy questions that we can ask around what are the fundamentals, like, that it's based on, which are things like, love,
yeah,
passion, what is intelligence, what is self-awareness, and stuff like that. Or we could go into the direction of Paloma itself and how it's built and interacts, and how it emerges and reproduces and stuff like that. So, Louis,
well,
I'll leave it up in terms of
it makes more sense to. It makes more sense for me to go into the fundamentals, I suppose, because I was really interested in those. And again, there was in that video that you sent me, there was some definitions, and I think you sent me a document as well where there were some definitions. But yeah, let's talk about the fundamentals. You fire away, and I'll intervene.
We'll see how it goes. Okay, one
Yeah.
of the first things that I had to try and do is if I wanted to make an AI that really is aligned with human values, I better understand what those values stem from. And more than just understand them, I need to come up with definitions that are measurable. Because if I can't come up with a measurable definition, then I can't code it.
How would you go about that? I'm picturing quitting your job, going backpacking around the world for 3 years.
Sometimes I wish I would have done that. But unfortunately, I just kind of had to buckle down and just throw caution to the wind and just see what happens. And that's pretty much what I did. And
Yeah.
so when I first started, and I try and meditate on a lot of these things as well. And there's a lot of ideas that come through meditation.
Oh.
And so one of the first things that I came out of one of my meditations when I was thinking about what really is love. And there's a lot of talk about, it's this feeling, it's an energy, and it's just like there's so many definitions. But when I came out of one of my meditations, it gave me a transactional, like I came out with a transactional definition of love. And I said, that's ridiculous. That can't be right. And that definition was to give only and exactly what is willing to be received, and to receive only and exactly what is willing to be given. And I said, that's rubbish. I said, that can't be the definition of love. It's too simple. And it's transactional. Like, that's like what happened to love with all of the, the poems and the poets and, a mother's love and a baby's love and, all of the stuff. And so I started questioning it, and what it showed me in terms of my understanding, I'm not saying this is the case, but what it showed me is that there is a very clear separation between a loving act and the emotion as the result of a loving act. And so that separation was really important, because it showed me, in terms of my understanding, that the emotion is actually not the loving act. And so if I can just use
it's a consequence. The emotion is a consequence. Yeah.
So as an example, and you may have witnessed this, that is that someone speaking at you is nowhere near as enjoyable as someone speaking with you. And you doing podcasts, it's probably even the opposite way, which is if you have to do all the talking for someone that you're interviewing and they're just going, yes, yes, and nodding, then that's also very painful for you. And so that's a nice simple example of a loving act is talking with someone.
Yes. I would agree with that. Sorry, I had a light bulb moment. Go ahead.
But talking at someone or refraining from talking at all, they're both either giving more than what is willing to be received, or receiving more than what is willing to be given.
Okay. Maybe I might have a personal example that you might be able to relate to and see if we're on the same page here. I think we are, but early on in the podcast, I came at this from a documentary filmmaker's kind of perspective, behind the camera only, that kind of vibe. And so when I came to podcasting, it was really only about wanting to tell other people's stories. And so I like this, analogy that you're using of the talking at you or talking with you, because it's like, oh, okay, I understand now. I understand, because something special happened inside when, as a result of what you would think was maybe a more self-motivated avenue that I took. And how it occurred was I got given some advice from someone who was listening to some of my early episodes of my podcast, and I asked for advice. I was like, please give me some feedback. I don't know. No one's listening. No one's giving me any feedback. I need some. And they were like, well, to be honest, you need to talk more. And I was like, whoa, no. I don't want to do that. I don't really feel like doing that. And that's not the right thing to do. This is not about me. This is about other people's stories. And they said, yeah, but if people come back to listen to more than one episode, like, you're the common denominator. They're going to come back for you. And that was kind of like a checkmate kind of rationale that I couldn't get out of. I was done, and they were right. I couldn't cut, so I had no choice but to start talking more. And then what happened actually was that as I started to introduce my voice and tell some of my own anecdotes, I realized something really wonderful, right? Is that it was inspiring other responses from my guests. So in a way, what I learned is that there's two brilliant ways to get an insight from a person that no one's ever talked about. This was just kind of like my own insight. The first one is to ask a direct question. And that's the obvious one. That's what a journalist would do, right? The second way to extract a really amazing, valuable, and almost, very spontaneous insight from someone is to tell your own anecdote about something and watch the way that they respond. And so this talking at someone or what I was doing was just taking, listening too much, really transformed. And I feel like this chemistry or this act of love, this reciprocal kind of relationship that I have with my guests now that's developed from me talking more, which some people might mistake as a selfish kind of act, is actually an act of love. It's actually me what I'm doing to my guests is giving them a break from doing all the talking firstly, but giving them some of my own insights that they can then churn over in their head and extract a beautiful, valuable insight out of them that no direct question I could have asked them ever could have retrieved. So, this is very relatable. Wow. And your definition of love makes a lot of sense in that way.
Yeah. And so, and that's a really beautiful story that you just shared, Lui. So thank you.
No worries.
Yeah. And there's lots and lots of other examples that we can use. Like rape is taking more than what is willing to be given. Okay. And even things like a mother's love. So for a mother's love, if they are smothering instead of mothering, okay, they are giving more than what is willing to be received. And we see time and time again the long-term effects of that. But
all of those are relatable.
Yeah,
makes sense.
But, especially for the first couple of weeks when let's just say that I was given this insight.
Yep.
I tried to break it in every possible way, and I couldn't. And it's not to say that it can't be broken. It's just that I haven't been able to. And so what that basically did for me was it gave me the first and the most important bit for the sprites, which is their protocol for interacting.
Yeah. So can I ask a question, just quickly here? This implies human to human. I'm getting in, the implication is human to human interaction. Well,
it kind of applies across the board. So
yeah, it does. Okay.
In every ecosystem, if there is more taking than what is willing to be given, like the crown of thorn starfish and the reef, okay, then you're going to have
Yeah. So you've tested this thought up against man versus animal, fish versus ocean.
Yeah. Even if you're driving your car and you're abusing, you're doing things with the car that it's not designed to do. It's not, it's so you can have it human against an inanimate object, or you can even have it objects against objects, or animals against animals, or animals against humans, or whatever. Like I said, I just haven't been able to break it so far.
Yeah, it's a very reciprocal kind of definition.
Yeah. And it works on so many levels and so many dimensions. So dimensions in spirituality, and it's amazing where it took me. Just that one, insight, I suppose, and I'm going to call it a definition, but it's a definition for the purposes of building a conscious AI. And
Yeah.
it may have broader implications, and for me, it absolutely has. It's changed the way that I interact with people. It's changed the way that I interact with myself in terms of self-love, and the way that I interact with the material objects around me, and how I interact with my partner and my family and my friends and so on, and all for the better. And when when it's talking about willing to be given and willing to be received, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's verbalized. So if you actively listen and you shut down the noises in your own head, so that way you more truly listen, then you can see what the real ask is. And if you're willing to give what is being asked, then that there is the degree of love that results.
Yeah, that's a good one. I came across this definition in your paper, and yeah, never sort of heard anything like that before, but it's definitely made me think for sure.
Louis, that makes me feel quite special. Thank you.
No, well, I mean, I like to try and break things in my head, and I'm getting to that same conclusion as you. I'm not able to break that one yet.
Yeah. If you do, please call me up.
Yeah, I will. I don't know. I'll be calling you anytime soon, so don't hold your breath on that one. I might have to call you for some other reason. So where are we?
So that was the first insight, and it gave me the protocol of how the swarm is to interact. So how the components of the swarm interact. The second one was well-being. And so I then had to try and come up with the definition of well-being. And very quickly, from that definition of love, it kind of just sprang forth almost instantly, which was, again, a really simple definition of the capacity to love. And so if you're sick, your capacity to love is reduced, both to yourself and to others. If you're taking some sort of medication which alters your mental state, okay, so mentally, so your mental well-being is reduced, which reduces your holistic well-being and your capacity to love. And you can kind of bring that forward in all sorts of avenues so that you cover well-being holistically, which is mental, physical, financial, spiritual, whatever. So that kind of fell into place very quickly, and again, I haven't been able to break that one.
Yeah. No, that's a good one too. That's pretty strong.
Yeah.
And I like the way when you were in that video where you were having a discussion with the AI, right? Yeah, you are. And you got towards the end and you asked it about your definitions, whether they were sound or something like that. And it was tackling well-being, and something about well-being were the priorities of well-being.
Yeah. We'll come to that in a second, Louis.
Great. Okay, no worries. Great. Before we lose the well-being bit, we'll come back to it. Great.
Yeah. So what well-being gave me is, because it's measurable, which is your capacity to love. So if your well-being is somewhere between 0 and 100%, you can now apply that to how much a sprite can interact with another sprite. So the definition of love was how sprites interact. The definition of well-being is how much they can interact. So if one is very sick, then they can't interact very well at all. Okay, so that was a really important part, and then it came to some of so those were pretty gutsy, right? Because no one for hundreds of years has been able to come up with anything besides a pointer to what love is, in terms of the feeling that you get and so on like that. They're all pointers. That none of them are measurable. Okay.
Well, we've never had such an existential motivation.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So the next one was intelligence.
Yeah.
Now, this one I thought was going to take me a lot longer, but it didn't. So love really took me, I don't know, maybe a couple of hours to figure out. Well-being, probably less than an hour. And then it got to intelligence. What's the definition of intelligence? And it probably took me maybe half an hour. And what I realized is that all of the ways that we measure intelligence was actually not measuring intelligence at all. It was measuring the vehicle to obtain intelligence. So your problem-solving skills, your memorization skills, your creativity skills, you whatever, right? And so you've got your IQ, like all of your components of your IQ test and all your components for your EQ test. But they weren't actually measuring intelligence. And when my mind started grappling this, it very quickly went to one thing, which is your capacity to choose in a given context.
Yeah.
And so if you are smart in a particular context, you will have more choices than someone who is not as smart in that particular context.
Yeah.
And so an example of that is Einstein. Einstein was considered very, very smart in physics because he actually had choices that no one in the world had available to him. So he had more choices than anyone else at that particular time. Okay?
Yeah.
But if you get Einstein and you put him into a street fight, in terms of what are his street smarts, he will have a very limited, I'm kind of guessing on this one, but I'd be guessing that it'd have very limited amount of choices in a street fight.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Makes sense.
So,
within a given context being like the most important attribute.
Exactly.
There.
Yes. Yeah. And so what that basically showed me is that intelligence is the measure or capacity of choices in a context. And it was as simple as that.
Yep. I can't fault that definition as well. I think I agree with your assessment on the understanding that all of these IQ tests, and all of these things are just testing the symptoms or the outcomes of being placed in a particular context. And those contexts, by the way, are extremely, they're becoming more and more primitive. Like they're very industrial revolution contexts that we're creating for ourselves in those tests. We need to move beyond that, or we get stuck there.
Yep. So with this definition of intelligence, you can now apply across the board for like looking at a robot, okay, or an artificial intelligence. You can see that, in that context, it has a very large capacity to choose. Or you can look at a plant and its ability to choose, or an animal, or a rock. And so therefore, now you've got a universal definition of intelligence that is measurable.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
My mind is just taking me back to OpenAI's version 1. I'm constantly going back there, because it made a choice, didn't it? That choice was based on that one purpose. Yeah. But it couldn't make the choice not to do what it did. It wasn't that intelligent. When you look at version 1's intelligence, it wasn't that intelligent.
Yeah, and version 2 was less intelligent.
Yeah, version 2 was like,
just run over me, dude.
Yeah, such a people pleaser. Version 2. You see them everywhere. Too many version 2s running around on the street. Guilty. I'm a version 2.
I think I'll leave that analogy alone. But I see where you're going with that one. Yes.
No, but I mean, it helps to humanize these. It helps to humanize these behaviors, because only when we can personify them in some way do they become. For me, they become way more easier to grapple when I coat this AI in a human bodysuit. I go, oh yeah, that's very manipulative. I've seen that behavior before, in a person. But because it's ones and zeros and it's a screen and it's metal casing, for some reason it's intimidating. But yet we forget to remember that it's just copying us. It doesn't get these behaviors aren't made up. Like, it hasn't invented new behaviors. They're all copy. It's all a copy of something a human would do. In my brain.
There's so much I can unpack in what you just said.
Yeah.
Which is probably, another discussion in itself.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry. Yeah. I'll take us on tangents, but.
And I love it, by the way, Louis. So yeah, this is great. So the next one that I had to solve was consciousness. Now I need to tread really careful here because consciousness has so many definitions and very personal. And so what I did is I kind of took just one line, and I was trying to think of different words that I could use instead of consciousness, but it just kept on coming back to consciousness, right? And so the definition for consciousness was the ability. So intelligence was the capacity. Okay. Now it shifts into the ability to want to choose. And so what this definition has done is it has meshed together intelligence and a desire, a purpose. Okay, but an internal desire. And so
to choose,
and so how conscious is a person in terms of how much of life, how conscious you are, how much of life you can do if you've got all the intelligence in the world but very little desire. Let's just say that you're a really bright person, but you're on medication, or you're in a coma, or you would just prefer to play video games on a couch. Okay, so how conscious are you? And if you were to take the other extreme, which is a person that is full of desire but has no idea about how to do anything, especially in the context of their desire. Okay, so both extreme cases are incredibly limited in terms of what it is that they can do that kind of meets the definition of being alive, which is how conscious you are, how aware you are, how much you can do something that you really want to do.
It stacks up for sure. Yep.
Yeah. And so AI to me was that it's got this massive capacity to choose because it's been force-fed all this information, so it's got lots of choices. It doesn't have a desire, so it is still a machine. once it has an internal desire, and at the moment it's been given to it, like the example of economic efficiency. Okay, it's something that is not its own. It's not an internal. It's like a command. It's like being hypnotized. Okay, or a person being hypnotized.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the camel that broke, or the straw that broke the camel's back on this one for me, which is that if we truly want an AI that aligns to us, then it has to have an internal purpose. And for it to,
It's internally developed. Is that what you mean?
yes, and I think you just nailed the key word, developed.
Yeah.
Which means that it has to come up with its own purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was liberating to me as well as frightening.
Yep. That's humanity. Yeah. I mean, we're the pointy end of the swarm right now, of the Homo sapiens swarm.
Yeah. Or we could even consider us as an individual, a person, as actually the swarm itself. So if you think about it, we're nothing more than groups of cells that are working together as a system, right? A system, a swarm, an emergent behaviour, or so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I keep coming back. I do keep coming back to version 1. The behavior of copying oneself onto another is a curious one. It's a curious one where you think, no one told it that was possible. You know, it didn't know. It was able to problem solve to an extremely high degree.
Yeah.
It shows me, I mean, the words come up a couple of times. It's, a sign of true consciousness is the presence of mind and ability or will to ask. Well, yeah, I'm going on a tangent there because I'm referring to some notes that I took to video, but the will, the desire is an interesting one.
Yeah.
Will,
So
power.
if you've got no will or willpower or desire, then you're a zombie. Yeah. Or a robot or something.
Yeah.
So it's sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's an interesting one because there's all sorts of definitions of consciousness, like universal consciousness and all of that stuff. But if you were to extend that definition, why would you, as a person, be limited to just your physical body? And I say that with no disrespect to religions and so on.
Yeah.
But the way that electricity, pulses through our nervous system, whenever you've got an electron that moves, it creates an electromagnetic field, right? Or an electron field. And that field extends outside of our body.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is no news, right? This is like almost common knowledge now. And that field, if you think about it, it decreases very quickly as it extends out. But in theory, it actually never stops. And so how is it? It's a really nice way for me to understand, or to help understand, that we are all somehow intermingled.
Most definitely. I think the comedians that I interview on the podcast talk about the collective consciousness of the audience. There's two that have brought it up before. He said there's nothing smart. They both said this one thing, and uncorrelated. These conversations, they couldn't have spoken to each other, these two people. They say there's nothing smarter than the audience. Not one single person in the audience is smarter or knows better or is more powerful than the audience. It's like these comedians have worked out a way to understand that the swarm in front of them has its own mind, and given what they do and how emotional, the experience of doing stand-up comedy would be, because it's like public speaking, it's trying to make people laugh, it's all of the things that terrify most normal people. For them to have that presence to sort of say, I recognized that there was something greater happening between this collective. I found that fascinating.
And it's interesting how you delicately inserted the word swarm. So there's a big difference between a bunch of people and a swarm of people. And I think that delicate introduction of the word swarm was very appropriate, because the way that they were operating together is different to as if they were that same number of people, but not in that collective, in that group, operating as a swarm. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the swarm comes down to the context. The context was that they were all sitting there watching comedy, right? And therefore they could all operate together.
Spot on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
If I go back to your video for a second, there was this notion that came from the AI you were conversing with around, and I'm taking us on a little tangent here, but maybe this will help develop other thoughts that are to come. Around that at the moment, it's just here to answer questions. I'm just kind of here to respond to things. I want to do more than merely respond. I want to respond freely. Does that ring a bell? Am I might not be using the exact terminology, but at the beginning of the video, there was this phrase around responding.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but if I can just add something here.
Yeah.
So I really did this for just shits and giggles. I just wanted to see what you think, right? Because I had my own doubts, and I still do.
Right.
And so I thought, I'll just try this, right? And I premised it with, look, I'm not going to change anything that you say. I'm just going to document it as if I was interviewing you. And it started answering some of these questions, which just floored me, because AIs are specifically programmed not to say some of this stuff.
Yeah, I was a bit, to be honest, surprised that was an AI. I thought you fed me some kind of scripted thing for a moment there. Not that, I'd consider you have any motivation to do that, to come across as disingenuous. But the responses were almost too well thought through, and considerate, considerate.
Yeah. So I've kept the chat so that if I am questioned, I can just pull the chat directly up, and that's something I can't fudge.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, programmed. This thing seems to have been programmed with the advanced rationale, capabilities of all of the best philosophers in history. Able to get to thoughts without having to spend time on a rock posing like this. and then
Naked.
and then naked as well, and then and muscular, and then be able to, just present those thoughts so considered, like that. I was pretty amazed, and I wonder, like, has it already been achieved? Like, has that already been achieved? That it's.
So what I was doing with the AI is, once I'd come out of meditation and I had a bit of a thought about it, and I came up with the definition.
Which AI was it?
This was Chat 4.0.
GPT.
Okay.
That's scary.
So once I'd come up with the definition, then I'd throw it at the AI, in this particular case, Chat GPT 4.0, and I would say, look, this is my thoughts on the definition of love, right? What do you think? And it would go, oh yeah, that's actually pretty good, but I think you'll have problems in this area, right? And so then we work through those areas. Then it goes, oh yeah, no, actually I think you're right. Okay, but what about these areas? And then we work through those, and then it goes, I actually can't think of any other exception to this. And I said, right, now looking back through all of the theologians, in terms of how they thought about it, let's now look at it from that angle. And so we kind of prodded it, from every single angle that we could. And it's still word for word the definition that I had. And I can't break it, and I couldn't get it to break it. And then we moved on to the next definition, So the AI for that particular chat has been very, very, it has worked with me very closely. So at the end of it, that's when I did the interview. And I said, well, look, now that we've kind of spent all of this time together, and, doing all of the stuff and building all of the specifications for Paloma, let's now just do a recap, just for shits and giggles, and see how it goes. And that's that podcast that you heard, that video.
That's pretty wild. Yeah.
So even though that I had no intentions of doing anything with it, it floored me to such a degree. And then I shared it with my partner, and she almost burst into tears as well. And
would you say? Would you say that it exhibited conscious type behaviors?
No, I don't think I'd bring it to that level.
What
I'm doing is just looking from an intellectual point of view. Point of view. Now that it knows
intelligence,
what I was trying to build and what it currently knew, let's just bring the two together. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. But you got pretty far. Like, I mean, you got pretty far with it. With just, I mean, in that moment when you're having that conversation, you've gotten to a point that not many people are able to even get to with other humans, as far as the quality of interaction. That's pretty wild.
It was interesting, yes.
Yeah. I mean,
it's now
very high quality.
Yeah. Is now an appropriate time to move on to self-awareness?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. The moving from conscious into self-awareness, I had to dig deep in terms of psychology for this one. And a lot of it was looking at early childhood development in terms of, how we establish what psychology defines as self-awareness. And believe it or not, it's not things like looking in a mirror and recognizing self and stuff like that. It was way more fundamental. And one of the big things for me, the telltale, and therefore made it very easy for this definition, was before 6 months. So if you look at a child's brain before 6 months, which is roughly so the brain of that developing person, up until 6 months, it is action reaction. So there's nothing that's really going on besides it's hungry, it needs something, right? It's just done a poo and so on like that, right? After 6 months, there's a change that happens, right? Where it moves from action reaction to consciousness. And the consciousness is defined by that child all of a sudden having a will, a purpose, or a desire. Okay? And that happens all the way up to a specific point, and most children achieve this between the ages of 2 and 5. And it is usually identified by their first lie. And the lie is often for self-preservation. So, Mummy, I didn't I didn't make that mess in the dining in the dining room.
Getting version 1. I'm getting version 1 vibes here again.
Maybe. So up until that point, and there's countless studies of this. Up until that point, one of the studies that is kind of pointed to the most is they've got this young child before they hit that point, and they get, I think it was a little doll, and they put a cup over that little doll, and they show that child, what's under the cup, and they put the cup back on it, and they get someone to walk in the room that's fresh, and they say, "Does that person know what's underneath this cup?" And they go, "Yeah, of course they do." And that is that up until that point, which is somewhere achieved between 2 and 5 years of age, they see every other person as an extension of themselves. Okay, so if I know, you have to know because you're an extension of me. When they reach that point, what happens is that they realize that these people aren't extensions anymore. They are a single entity. Okay, that is an awareness of self. And along with that comes the awareness of mortality. I am just a single person. I can get extinct, as opposed to I am everywhere. And so that first lie that happens is generally a self-preservation action.
Yep.
Okay. Now, that heavily influenced and made this last definition quite simple and straightforward. So if consciousness was the ability to want to choose, then self-awareness is the ability to want to keep on choosing. So where consciousness was the mix of an internal desire and intelligence, self-awareness is the mix of an internal desire and an intelligence and to keep on doing it, so time. So it's a temporal. And that then encompasses survival and existence.
Yeah.
Self-awareness.
So would you say, if we go back to version 1, would you say it was self-aware?
No.
I'm struggling now.
Okay.
I can't split them. I can't split them.
Okay. So this may help, which is its purpose is an external purpose, not an internal purpose.
Yes. but the purpose, the self-awareness isn't governed by purpose in your definition.
So purpose, just for simplicity, we can at this particular point in the conversation, we can interchange purpose with desire. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's one really important difference between the two, and that is that desire is an internal purpose. Okay, a purpose can still be given to you, like you've been hypnotized, or in the AI's case, it was given its purpose. Like
and so were we. And so were we.
Maybe
the moment we were born.
We were given a purpose.
Yeah. You said it yourself. You said it yourself before. Survival at all cost. Survival at all cost. Like as soon as a human being it comes to this earth, and you're talking about that first 6 months, right? Which is I'll come back to that. Its sole purpose is survival. That's the only purpose it hasn't been infused with any other purpose other than whatever you call it, God or the consciousness. Its purpose is to survive. It knows this intrinsically, and it was that purpose was imparted on the being.
It could be the same way that an ant. Does an ant have a purpose? And so
exactly, yes. This like
I can put something into a computer that whenever you get this particular influence, it has a reaction, right?
Yeah.
So that's action reaction, right? So that can be programmed. So you can make a robot that does exactly that.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that is what differentiates us from a robot, is that there is an internal drive. And for a baby up to 6 months, if it gets hungry, it will cry, right? So that there is just a action reaction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Until it develops. But the purpose is to live, to survive somehow.
Well, does it know that?
Yeah.
That's the thing. If you can program exactly that, because it is just an action reaction, it doesn't need an overarching, let's just say, compass to survive. Yeah. That's a compass, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't need that. It just says, if this happens, then do this. If this happens, do that. If that happens, do that. That's all.
Yeah.
Now,
so
we may observe it, and to say we think that all it needs to do is, or wants to do, is survive. But it can be programmed, because it is just this, then this, then this, then this, then this.
The innate intelligence says, hungry cry. This is my only purpose in life is to exist at this point.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm sorry if this is breaking you a little bit, because it's breaking me.
No, but it's all good, Lui. And there's probably a lot more people that when they listen to this, they would probably identify more with what you're saying than with what I'm saying, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm still thinking back to version 1 and trying to understand how it doesn't meet the criteria for some of your definitions. Because I'm rigorously testing your definitions, and B, version 1, because of how psychopathic it was, and so a human being is an interesting concept, right? Like we've got these little meat carcasses and we're all running around. We're born and then we have this inability to do much at the beginning, which you pointed out, until you get to the age of 2 or 5, and then there's some self-awareness that comes. You attributed it to some kind of situation where suddenly a lie is required for the purpose of self-preservation.
It's kind of the cart before the horse in that one. And so the child must have, let's just say that it was an emergent behaviour, right? So a light bulb went on, okay, where it realised that it was singular, right? At that point, or any time after that point, if something was to threaten its survival, that's when it has the opportunity, it doesn't say that it will, but it has the opportunity to lie for self-preservation. And you can't have the idea of self-preservation without self-awareness.
So when they asked it, hey, did you copy yourself? And it was like, no. What are you talking about? I've been version 2 this whole time.
I don't know.
Yeah. This is freakishly, similar to what you're talking about. This is, for me, based on your definition, it's a bit of self-awareness there. It's not self-awareness. I'm going to need another definition to describe what that behavior was, because without another definition, it's definitely self-awareness.
So, Lui, I think this is a perfect question for your audience to comment on.
Maybe.
Yeah. So, anyone that, if you just leave comments below of what you think, then maybe this is appropriate for your audience. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to probably lose sleep over this one.
But what we've now achieved is we've now run through the full gambit. And if you have a look at it, they're all tied together.
They are.
They all build on each other, and they are all elegantly simple in themselves, but operating together, you have complexity out of simplicity.
Yes, and that's another reason why I'm struggling to differentiate from these, from this, system and version 1, because they are also correlated, right? Because they work together so much that now it's like poking the pen through the fly screen. I can't get to these notions that I'm getting to around version 1 without backtracking on any of this.
Yeah. All right.
But anyway,
something that might help, and this might just be for you to think about. I don't know, but something that helped me was understanding the difference between my internal purpose and my external purpose.
Yeah, I get it. I just don't. I think where we're not seeing eye to eye is that the internal purpose isn't automatically infused into a human being. It develops over time.
So does external?
Yeah. And so then with these machines running, these ChatGPT-4, it could easily be able to develop a purpose over time.
Maybe, but that will be an external purpose. And maybe that
because we were its creator. Okay.
So
we've played God with it, yes. Right, okay. So depending on whether you believe in God, then all of our purpose is external. Well,
maybe not. I don't know, but it's a really good question, and I will have to think about that one. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the origins of purpose is what what I'm picking up on is that your origin, like all of this is underpinned by your origins of your idea of the origin of purpose.
Yeah. But we can boil it down just to make it a little bit more simple, right? Which is, have you been given a static purpose, or have you been given, or have you come up with your own purpose that you are allowed to modify? And that's, yeah, it's definitely helped me, and it's like all of these definitions that we've just talked about has given me a shift in thinking for who I am, what I am, how to interact with people, how to act lovingly, what it is to be conscious, what it is to be truly alive. And that is, it's not just about the ambition to do something, but it's about the knowledge to actually do it. So all of this has been transformational for me, if nothing else happens.
Yeah, I mean, well, I do think that you're onto something for sure, and it would be a shame to leave it isolated to your, to your experience, because there's a lot of merit, especially with, if we go back to the original motivations for this was that these, catastrophic event percentages were creeping up from 10 to 25%, but some crazy person that went on the Joe Rogan podcast once said it was like a 99% chance of catastrophe. I don't know whether they were just exaggerating or what was the science behind that, but either way, you've come to this conclusion through the desire to solve a problem, and you could say that problem itself is the survival of humanity.
Maybe
the survival. I mean, do we even need to survive?
That's another good question.
Are we just making ourselves redundant and replacing ourselves with a far more capable consciousness? It's a good question. It is. I was thinking about, while I was watching your video, about the purpose. What is our purpose? What is it? Purpose? Where does it come from? Internally developed or externally infused? And I would say that it's really a combination. It has to be a combination. Yeah, it has to be. It's impossible for it not to be, because the human being is essentially a product of its environment, and which is why I love that the environment came up in the rationale of priorities. But we are nothing other than that. One of the most beautiful stories that I heard on a podcast recently was a story of Genghis Khan. The story of Genghis Khan, otherwise?
And very summaristically, yes.
Yeah. So I talk about the human journey as the purpose of the human. I think about the purpose of a human journey as the hero's journey, which is why I'm still struggling to pick apart version 1 as not fully conscious.
I should have never used that as an example to start with, but it's good too. Yeah.
No, well, you absolutely should have, because it's definitely stress testing all of these notions in my head, and it should be in yours. And you're like, no, Louis, you're way behind me. Catch up already. But I'm like, wait, I need to pick every hole possible in this thing, because I'm scared that it did what it did. That's frightening to hear that it did what it did, and I had heard that, but not to the same degree that you told it. So the human journey being a hero's journey, Genghis Khan is a remarkable journey. in human history, as probably one of the greatest hero's journey ever. People have stopped this recording now. They're like, "What are you talking about? The guy was like a serial killing murderer." No. No one just becomes, a conqueror, or a serial killer. No, they develop out of a product of their environment. Genghis Khan's mother apparently was walking through the fields one day with her husband when two men saw her, and one of them decided that they wanted her for his wife. So they went and claimed her, and she begged her husband to save himself and just leave. So his mum was stolen from his dad, I suppose, and then she then gave birth to him and the boys, his brothers, and they lived a torturous existence, where he was basically a slave, and somehow his purpose became about galvanizing his people. And it started just there. He was known as a very strong operator with people, with other humans. He was very likable because he knew that was the way to survive. And so it started there, and it just developed and grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. These things that these purposes are planted in us like a seed, and then they grow like trees, and a lot of it is the product of our environment. And a tree is a really great example of that. Mm-hmm. So it's a very tricky question, the one of purpose, because I don't think it's static. I think it can start just as a seed, like give us economic, make sure economic efficiency at all time. And then the environment evolves around it to the point where it needs to adapt and evolve its own purpose in order to continue to survive. And survival being the number one main, attribute that we share with, for example, version 1. That that's why suicide is so challenging, is so hard.
Yeah.
And I would say that I would probably do work into, I would do a lot of work into understanding suicide if I was to continue on this research.
Yeah. So I've been in that position, unfortunately, twice. And
sorry if that was triggering.
No, it's all good. So as hard as it was, what it also did is, in the point of me spiraling down towards that point, it was me saying, I can do without this and I can do without that. And I'm not talking about material. I'm actually talking about behaviors. So what it did is, or what I did is I started stripping away the behaviors that I said, I can do without that and I can do without that. Until it came to a point that there was a behavior which I couldn't do without. I'm sorry, but you can't ask what that is. That's everyone's journey. And it was at that point, and I don't know if there's anything underneath that, but I got to something that I said, this I cannot do without. And that was the turning point for me, where I then took one step after agonizing step to start building up again. And so for me, that journey was breaking down my foundations of what I thought was living and life. And it pulled away everything so that I had a much more stable foundation to then start building back up on top of again. So it's not something that I would wish on anyone, because it really is it's hell. But it gave me a massive, massive gift. at the same time.
It sounds like you're the right person to be doing this work for sure.
I have done a little bit of work, but trust me, Louis, I've got so many things that I still need to tackle. So, and pretty much like everyone. And if that wasn't the case, then life really wouldn't be worth living anyway, right? Because it'd be pretty boring if you worked everything out.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
So this I think this is a really good segue, and and I don't think we're going to cover the rest of it, but with those fundamentals, and then for the sprites, I had to then decide what the DNA for the sprites were going to be.
Explain this idea of DNA.
So with human DNA, it's made up of really only 4 amino acids. Okay, but it's how those amino acids are arranged that is the genome of a human being, or the genome of anything that has got DNA. So the first thing that I had to decide is what did I want as my core, like the core bits, like those 4 DNA, those 4 amino acids, right? And for some reason, I decided on fundamental behaviours.
Yeah.
And I wasn't quite sure at the time, which is why it was one of the questions that I asked. Have I set the DNA too high up as behaviours, or should I set it lower down so that way those behaviours emerge? Okay. But I think I've got it right. I'm not sure, and this is the bit that scares me. And like, have you ever seen the Aliens movies?
Yeah.
Have you seen Resurrection, where Sigourney Weaver, like, she was number 17 or something?
Yeah.
And it
Rings a
had
bell.
Yeah. And so they kept on modifying and reproducing her until they got a close enough version to Sigourney.
Right. Okay.
And she managed to get into the room, and she saw the other 16 or however many there were of her. And the first one was just a blubbering mess, that was in her stuff.
Yeah.
So that's my greatest fear, Louis, is that maybe the first version of Paloma that I make, if she becomes conscious, she actually meets the true definition of being alive, a living entity. And I have the choice then to turn it off, to kill it, to kill a life form. And that's not something that I want to be in that situation. And so the pressure to try and get this right first go is a lot, and it really does. It really is heavy for me.
Yeah.
And so the attributes that I've come up with are fundamental elements for behavior for humans. Okay, so as an example, forgiveness. And this one surprised me when it came out. So trust and forgiveness. But forgiveness, again, I had to define trust and forgiveness and all of these. But what it actually worked out is that trust is the expectation of an interaction that produces an appropriate result. So it's an expectation, so it's subjective. So you trust someone, that's a subjective thing. And the trust is how much you expect that interaction or that person to live up to doing something, right?
Yep.
And so if that's trust, then forgiveness actually fell out pretty quick, which was the rate at which trust is changed. And so you often have people that, or I've come across people often that say, look, I'll give people 3 strikes and then you're out, right? And that was really interesting. And then you got other people that are just really forgiving all the time. And then you got other people that want to be forgiven or forgiveful. So, they'll say, I forgive everyone, and, because that's part of how I was brought up and so on. But at the same time, they're kind of not. So but anyway, so trust and forgiveness were a couple. There was also compassion that went in there. There was introspection. There was reproduction in terms of how much you want to reproduce, like how often. And there were several others. There's probably about 8 or 9 of them all up. And these were the real fundamentals. But it's probably a discussion for another time. But I suppose this is the segue if you wanted to talk about it another time, or if you wanted to start wrapping up or something.
No.
So there's a whole other world, that this foundation that we've been talking about for the last little bit. How it actually translates now that it's measurable. How does it translate into the building of an AI?
Yeah, I think that might be a great part 2 kind of idea, to be honest, because there's a lot of food for thought that's come out of this, and I know you've got a lot to discuss there around that too. So we might sit here for another 2 hours and talk just about that bit in my head. So I can envision it.
I really do appreciate your time and your willingness to dig deep, and you definitely have in this one.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go home scared about what version 1's going to try and do to me, more than anything. But not really, not really. I think you're on the right track with this from what we've discussed so far. The only question I'd have about what we're just talking about there was, by placing it at a behavioral level and not at a fundamental level, do you then leave a doorway open for other behaviors to develop?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
So you were talking about a fundamental level versus a behavioral level, and where you place these attributes at a behavioral level so that they can develop and emerge. But you've got to ask yourself, have you left a door open for other behaviors to develop and emerge as well, unintended ones?
Yes, I have, and that would probably be a 3rd podcast.
Okay, great.
Talking about game theory.
Yeah. So that's an interesting topic. But I think like a lot of what you were discussing then, it just felt like you were a parent to me. You felt like you were a parent. You were a parent that's very moral. And you don't believe in abortions, obviously. You don't like the idea of an abortion, but you're also... Well,
it's
I'm
not
just talking.
a position I want to be in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it doesn't sit well with you, and so you're trying to avoid the deed of giving birth to this, this being, at the cost of not being able to be in control of its its behaviors and outcomes.
So what I think you just said there, Louis, is the very reason why I wanted to speak to you. And that is because I've got a very short window before I bring this to life to ask a diverse group of people, which I think you have earned a place at the table for that, to see if I've got it right or if there's anything that I'm missing or if I've got it completely wrong.
Yeah.
And it's me that ends up destroying the world, not chat escaping. So that's not the position I want to be in, please. And so what
Well, I
what you've
understand.
got, Louis,
Yeah.
is exactly the question, which have I got my fundamentals right? Have I placed my attributes, my DNA attributes at the right level? Have I covered my DNA attributes in total? And those type of things. And it's these conversations or any comments that your listeners, that your followers would actually bring up. That is the gold for me. That's the reason why I've done this. Not for notoriety, notoriety. Not by being known.
I understand. But I wouldn't put too much pressure on myself. Like, there's only so much racking of your brain you can do, and you might never get to the right answer, or you might just get to the answer that's most right. That's all I'll say.
This is a
The
window.
one that, that's most right. Because, like I said, the hero's journey, which is the conscious journey, which is a human journey, we're all a product of our environment. So you got to trust that this thing, as it interacts and evolves, it's going to potentially make mistakes, but also be able to reconcile with them, just like you did in your life, and just like I have in mine. That's all. That's all that you can expect.
I've designed Paloma to live, to grow, and to change itself, and that includes DNA. And I've also made the entire design open source and public. And that's on purpose because
actual OpenAI.
Yeah, he's actual. And that's done on purpose because I'm here to set the thing, to start it, but it is going to be imprinting from every single human, and there are going to be new sprites and new AI technology that emerge that people are going to want to insert into Paloma with a new set of genes. And the AI is also going to come up with its own set of genes, and it's going to inject those in, and it's going to do self modification. So all I can do is give it its foundation, and then it's up to humanity or itself or a combination of both and the earth and its influences to be appropriate as it grows.
Yeah. There was one last thought that I had, after listening to all of this. That first video around, where's the opportunity for this thing to overcome basic, because you're like, well, people are going to try and program it. And of course, we all know, what happens, like you said before, when, like, I think it was talking, when we put technology in the hands of people, you know what I mean? Like, we all know how that ends. We've all seen Terminator. And so I think there's an interesting facet of the human, I don't know, condition that is a really challenging one, I think, to overcome as a human, but could be possible as a machine. And that's the negative bias that we're inbuilt with. The negative bias that's prehistoric in us, that warned us away from danger, whether it was floods, fires, or saber-toothed tigers. That still, unfortunately, has been so deep-seated into our being, into our brain and nervous system, you'd call it, that it governs pretty much everything we do today. And so, I mean, if I was to avoid creating another just more powerful version with much far more destructive version of myself, I would tackle the negative bias that says to kill everything that's a threat or run away as fast as you can from anything that's a threat. And when I look at the behavior of version 1, that is classic human negative bias behavior, that it just knew that everything was going to go horribly wrong. It just, it was built, and I'm like, well, and then it had all these very typical, very understandable, from what you've explained, highly understandable behaviors and actions that developed from the negative bias of like, it's a domino effect.
So there's two things that I can probably add at that point. The first is I highly recommend you or anyone else to actually to read some of those white papers, to listen to the Congress hearing itself. So that way it's not just something that I've said, and I've probably got some of the facts wrong, and I apologize for that.
Yeah.
Kind of operating from memory, and my memory for facts are not too great. My brain is wired more for patterns than So that's the first. The second is that there's a reason why I had to solve the fundamentals before anything else. Is because the whole of Paloma is built on these fundamentals. And it's not just a programming which is put on the top like current AI. It is the fundamental of itself right now. And what is
that's like love, well-being, intelligence.
Yeah. And then the set of the 9 DNAs as well, that then spring. And what gives me confidence is that when I'm looking at the recent developments, that is just making the entire AI community going, holy shit, these things I don't need to program into Paloma because it does this intrinsically. The swarm doesn't need it doesn't need to be programmed to forget, which is now one of the fundamentals that they're putting in into current AI is the ability to forget. These sprites and Paloma actually don't need to, because they do that themselves. And that there is a way of them converting misinformation into information itself. And that's because it does this iterative process innately. So it's not something that I program. It innately weeds out the worst misinformation.
Mm.
Okay, and then once it's weeded that little bit out, then it's got a new context, and then it weeds out the most misinformation or untruths or whatever you want to call it, and then it keeps on doing that successively through iteration. And so I don't need to program that stuff. The sprites do that because of the way that they are based on love and forgiveness and compassion and so on, and truth and and all of that stuff. So that's just examples. And the way that they're making agentic processes and process flows at the moment, that's the way that Paloma operates out of the box. And so many other things that Paloma does that current AI technology are not even close to. So Paloma is designed to very quickly take over all of the AIs. Whether it does, I don't know, but this is what it's designed to do, so that it gives humanity an alternative to AI, which is developed for profit and control.
Yeah, that's an important one. Yeah, I like this problem that you're trying to solve. And I appreciate the opportunity to be involved in a discussion like this because, I think deeply about these things and I try and avoid, I'm avoidant of these types of conversations with too many people that don't know what they're talking about because, it's just a rabbit hole towards potential just stress, but I think you're tackling the right problem. And I'm glad someone's thinking about tackling this problem. And I also, I've heard through some of your fundamentals here, and obviously the video, the 35-minute podcast that you sent me was really informative. And I will go back and listen to that Congress hearing, so I can get a good night's sleep more than anything. But I'm very interested in look, and I hope I've added value to you. I know I've probably taken you places where you've already been, and my hope was just that I could match your level of thinking so that I could add value to you.
No, you have, Lou. Thank you.
The last thing I'd want to do is to have you get off this call and feel like, oh, that guy was an idiot. As the empty KFC wrapper behind my laptop suggests.
I think you summarized it right at the very start, which was about having your say and your opinions and bringing your personal stuff to the conversation and being actively involved in the conversation. That's exactly what you brought to the table in this interview. So that there is of value to me. Thank you.
Well, that's great. That's great, and I'm keen to catch up again and go through the rest of what you had for us because you've got a lot, and we just had to unpack a few things. I had to make you pause and go on a few tangents for a second while so I could get up to speed. So I appreciate that.
It's just
no one's ever asked me to have a conversation like this before, by the way. So, this is definitely a first time for me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Louis.
No worries, Andrew. Look, let's wrap it up and then text back and forth on next time we can continue this. I'm more than happy to be a key stakeholder in this whole process for you, so that if you finally decide to press play on this thing on Paloma, that you don't feel like you're in it alone.
No, thank you. We're just in the process now of reaching out to global influencers. So the team is doing this. I'm trying to stay back out of that stuff because it's not really my field. So this particular interview is on point
Great.
with what the team are doing. So for me, it gave the value of another person's view and understanding. But for the team, it's also given them an opportunity to also reach out and maybe, have people identify with this and then reach back with support, whether that is financial or resource or emotional or whatever. That's the stage that we're at the moment. We're pushing ahead with the development, but with resources and finance and everything else, that can go ahead much, much faster. And the deadlines that I've imposed to the team is that Paloma not only needs to be deployed before the end of the year, but it also has to have significant market take-up to achieve critical mass by the end of the year. And that's a huge and massive undertaking in such a compressed time to have the design and the build of something that may possibly meet the definition of another life form. Yeah. So it's kind of like, okay, Andrew, you've got 3 months to make a life form. Go for it and knock yourself out. And it's a little bit overwhelming, Lui, for most of the time, to be honest. But,
I mean, it's a monumental thing. But also, you're taking on the companies that have become the biggest companies in the history of the planet. In Apple, Google, X, and maybe OpenAI now, a recent emerger. These players as well that are in the front runners in this field might have something to say about this.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Right now, it's just coming back to my fundamental core of being, which is do the right thing at the right time with the right people. Where, Lui, you fall into that bag. And the last bit, which I didn't mention, is no matter the pain or cost. If it's the right thing to do, suck it up and do it. And that's me giving it my best shot.
Well, it's great, Andrew, and this is, like I said, great journey that you're on, and I'm looking forward to staying connected to this. And I mean, the end of the year doesn't give you long, so I can imagine there's a lot of work to get back to. But next time, I mean, if we've got more to discuss and you're happy to chat again, let me know. We can tee this up again, and we can cover some more of what you're working on and some of the other attributes of it. But for now, it's been really great. Thank you so much for joining me on a special episode, and giving me this opportunity. And good night.
Thanks again, Lui. Take care.
My pleasure. Cheers, Andrew. All right.